Hey everyone, welcome. Good evening. My name is Spencer Ruckty. Thank you for tuning in today. I am the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. I am so pleased to welcome you to today's conversation between Joshua Ferris and Aimee Bender. They are with us today to discuss Josh's new book, A Calling for Charlie Barnes, which is just out. First of all, I invite you all to use the Zoom chat, the chat window at the bottom of your screen to say hello, tell us where you're coming from. And second, I want to thank you through virtual events like today's. Third Place Books is fortunate to continue connecting readers with authors in an intimate setting. We do sorely miss having authors in our stores, but at the same time, we're thankful to have this digital platform that brings our growing event series into your homes all across the world. So thank you again for tuning in today and for supporting independent bookstores. We are very proud to host a number of exciting virtual events this fall, which you can find on our website, thirdplacebooks.com, including this Friday. We have Jess Walter on October 15th to celebrate the paperback release of The Cold Millions. We have Jean Kwok and Catherine Lacey on the 20th. They'll be discussing Jean's debut novel, Go Home, Ricky. We have Glory Edom, who is the founder of Well Read Black Girl, on October 26th, and we have so much more. For a reminder about these events and more, you can sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com. As I mentioned before, the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and we really encourage you to use it and do so respectfully. Tonight, we will also have some time for your questions. So if you have any questions for our authors this evening, you can please submit those to the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captioning for those who are interested. You can just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on and off. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and understanding. But most of all, thank you for sticking with us during this virtual era. It's really strictly because of you that this author series is even possible. And with all that housekeeping out of the way, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Joshua Ferris is the author of 3 previous novels, Then We Came to the End, The Unnamed, and To Rise Again at a Decent Hour, as well as a collection of short stories, The Dinner Party. He was a finalist for the National Book Award, winner of the Barnes & Noble Discover Award and the Penn Hemingway Award, and was one of the New Yorker's 20 under 40 writers in 2010. To Rise Again at a Decent Hour won the Till and Thomas Prize and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. His short stories have appeared in the New Yorker, Granta, and Best American Short Stories. Joshua is joined in conversation by the masterful fiction writer Aimee Bender, the author of the novels The Butterfly Lampshade, The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake, which was a New York Times bestseller, An Invisible Sign of My Own, and the collections The Girl in the Flammable Skirt, Willful Creatures, and The Color Master. Her works have been widely anthologized and have been translated into 16 languages. The book tonight is A Calling for Charlie Barnes, a book that is really an audacious masterpiece about fathers and sons from one of the tenderest writers at work today. This novel has all of the corporate wit of Then We Came to the End, paired with so much of the inventiveness and preoccupation with storytelling and narrative framing that we've come to expect from Ferris's work over the years. This novel really does contain Ferris at his best, dialed down to the sentence level, and I can't wait for you all to read it. Also, if you order from us, we have these lovely signed book plates, courtesy of Josh, and we'll include one with every order. If I'm not convincing enough for you, I will also say that Sam Lipsyte just gave this book a tremendous review in the New York Times, writing, quote, Ferris is in shrewd command of his thematic and syntactic trajectories. This novel is a passionate, well-constructed, often hilarious, and at times profound plunge into grief, both civic and intimate, as well as a culmination so far of the literary exploitations Ferris has been undertaking since he arrived. So that is a review, essentially what I said, right? I think. But with that, I can't wait to join in watching this conversation with all of you tonight. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Ferris and Aimee Bender. The screen is both of yours.
Well, thank you, Spencer. You have me blushing. You're very kind. And I should say thank you to you, Aimee. I know I've said it now twice, but I have to say it a third time so
publicly.
the folks publicly so that the folks know how grateful I am to be. I don't think I've ever said it, but it's true. I think you do know that I went to Irvine after you, and you were the rock star. You were like everything that the young rookies wanted to be, but we also had this enormous admiration for your work. And so I feel just super honored that you'd come on here with me and chat about this new book of mine.
Well, it's totally my pleasure. I love the book and I'm excited to talk about it. And yeah, the Irvine connection is a really nice one, and maybe we'll get to talking about that too.
Yeah.
So you're going to start us out with reading some pages.
All right, so I'm going to read, I think, from this section where it's kind of late in the book. I've never read this section before, so we'll see how that pans out. It's late it's middle. So my main character, Charlie Barnes, is ailing. He's had pancreatic cancer, and he's just had a procedure called the Whipple procedure, and he's recovering, and his son is there. His son has flown home to tend to him and take care of him. So this is where it's entering in, and they're watching on the television. And I should say that this bit here, it starts when he's in high school, or he's reflecting on when he was in high school. We watched more TV than you could possibly imagine, more even than when I was in high school and living with him and Evangeline in Downers Grove. Back then, we had a 32-inch Sony Trinitron console set in solid oak, which he worked from his recliner by the luxury of remote control. I was 16 when I bought a replica of that remote at a Radio Shack in the mall and synced it to the television. On nights I was bored, I would climb from my window and stand outside the house on Benton Avenue, moving the volume subtly up and down. Sometimes I changed the channel. Charlie Barnes liked channel 7. I liked channel 9. He would look up from his newspaper. He was never in front of the television without his newspaper, confounded by the sudden change. It seemed to have taken place entirely by some occult power. He reached for his remote on the TV tray and restored order before going back to his newspaper. I would let maybe a minute pass before changing it back to 9. He looked up, very solemn. I still have my regrets about this. I had not yet emerged from my punk-ass bitch phase. What reason did I have to believe Charlie wouldn't abruptly change his mind and send me packing off to foster care? I just wasn't convinced that I deserved the fighting chance he was giving me. I was still smoking too, and lifting the occasional greeting card, but back to him in that recliner, mouth gone slack in mystification. What the hell is going on with my television? He got to his feet and pulled the curtain back. Insecure Charlie Barnes was the first to believe that someone might be toying with him as he peered angrily out at the night. A veteran delinquent, I was well hidden, but silently shaking with laughter because I could still see him. On a different night entirely, he simply stood up and started banging on the television as if that ever works. Well, why shouldn't it? I correlated one of those bangs with a channel change, then another, and another, until he had every reason to believe that his Sony was obeying him in this crudest of manners, appeasing an angry God. And when at last it could be trusted that channel 7 would hold, he carefully withdrew, picking across the carpet backward and reaching out with a blind hand for his recliner, keeping his eyes glued to the screen until he was seated again, this time demurely on the lip of the thing, as if fully occupying it might tempt fate. How carefully he sat there. I gave it a full 2 minutes before returning it to channel 9. I can't tell you how often he would resort during this mind-boggling episode to that impotent hope of the layman, unplugging the TV from the wall socket and plugging it back in again. One night, he even dragged poor, drowsy Evangeline out of bed just to have someone stand witness to his going mad. Of course, with the two of them in the middle of the room at the stroke of midnight, holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, I didn't do it. I didn't do a thing. Remember that old Merry Melodies cartoon about the frog with the golden voice who eventually drives his promoter insane because the beast will sing only for him? That TV went haywire only for Charlie Barnes. I found this amusing, as any teenager might in the twilight of my not giving a shit, before I came to believe in that house and my place in it. Finally, he took the TV in to have it repaired, but they sent it right back for no charge because there was nothing wrong with it. My poor Pop. In time, I stopped torturing him like this because I really did think he was going to lose his mind, and because I lost interest. He loved me. In between interruptions, like his consultations and follow-up appointments, we must have watched close to 1,200 hours of television over the course of his recovery from surgery and his 2 rounds of chemo. We watched or rewatched all of Cheers. We watched at least 2/3 of Seinfeld and half of Friends. Mindless, time-killing sitcoms helped keep him alive. There were also less familiar offerings like niche shows on the Sci-Fi Channel, Canadian whodunits, classic sitcoms he could remember loving back in the day, now so unwatchably bad that he questioned the judgment of his earlier self. If beloved old shows could crater, did that give the lie to today's entertainment? Personally, I did not know what to make of the show Lost, which struck me as both aimless and tedious, but uncanny too, in the way life itself is uncanny, full of a grand, anachronistic, possibly scripted intent. We got through it 6 seasons in 12 days. He was conked out half the time, healing up or dying a little more, maybe both, who could say? So that each show, each season, each series we completed must have been for him a kaleidoscope of narrative more than any coherent story. When he began to snore, I paused the television and peer over at him. I owed him everything. All right, should I stop there?
Thank you. It's great. I'd flagged a couple pages as possible spots to read, and there's something about the way you write about TV that's so satisfying and literary. So I'm glad you read that.
TV, I mean, as you know, TV just commandeers all topics at dinner parties and regular parties and now in Zoom calls about literary books.
Yeah, we can't get away from it, but it's somehow just so fun. I think to see so much of it like consolidated into this moment of recovery and family and how we understand that experience of just sitting in front of the TV and not speaking.
I was sitting at dinner the other night with my wife and my son, and we were talking about a character on television. And I suddenly understood that what we were allowed to do was talk about this entity, which was, a person ostensibly, with free abandon. We could criticize, we could really lay into this person and then pull back and then love that person in a different way. And I suddenly realized that's what TV gives us license to do, to talk shit about other people without hurting any feelings.
Right. It's the water cooler when we're not gossiping. We're just like talking about shows.
Yeah.
At one point, books. Yeah. I like that. So, there's so many possible starting points, but I think one that just feels to me like an entryway in is to I love Charlie Barnes as a character, and I feel like the book, not only the narrator, but the book itself is like a love letter to this character in so many ways. And I just wondered I feel like he's a part of a literary conversation about American businessmen. And I just wondered who were his forefathers and who affected you as a reader reading about this sort of, I just feel like he takes his place in conversation with various other characters. And I just wondered if you could start with that.
Yeah, I think probably the character most dear to my heart that he's in conversation with to some extent is not who you may think of first, but certainly would be first to come to mind for me, and that's Panine. Because Panine is sort of like lost in the world and aiming for things that seem just simply out of his reach. I mean, he's in this infinite task, or this eternal task, to write a kind of, history of Russia, cultural Russia, and it's just not going anywhere. He gets lost in the footnotes and slides down the slopes of the Dewey Decimal System, and he's so intoxicated by the dictionary and the words in the dictionary and all, and then reading about this, and so suddenly all of his work, hours and hours pass, he's no closer to his finishing his masterpiece. And so I think there's this sense of failure throughout Panine that is very touching, that certainly I think of when I think of Charlie Barnes. He's in a much different, culture, and he's born in a different country with different social mores and goals and ambitions and that sort of thing. But that sense of failure was very much, I suppose it was like Willy Loman in a way too. I mean, there's that connection, but for me, Panine, there's this pathos that attends his failure that's so touching, that I hope might, also be at play here.
Realizing I don't think I've ever heard Panine said aloud. Like it's
with the P.
Yeah, like it's just nice to be like, oh, right, that's right.
Actually, the guy,
but that sort of lovingness of, or like just the character's appetite really for the world in that way, but that sort of gets away from him in a certain way. Go ahead.
Yeah, like a lack of focus, really. I mean, there is such, I mean, the world is treacherous anyway, because it wants to seduce you with all the things that are great about it, and rich and infinite. And Panine is constantly, and this is way before the internet, constantly falling down wormholes, and never gets any closer to the realization of his greatest dreams. And in the meantime, like, you can just tell the world is just barreling right over him.
Right.
And he is being narrated by somebody who's very sly and has an agenda. And that agenda is, it's not neutral, but you're never really sure, is the sympathy being extended to Panine grudgingly extended by this narrator, or is it simply getting away from the narrator, because Panine is so touching. He's also a prickly little dude, Panine is. So there are instances where I want to chastise him, especially when he's mean to the librarian and says some, vaguely misogynistic things about librarians. And it's there. It's his whole world is on display. The fullness of his humanity is on display. He's not treated with kid gloves, but at the same time, you really have to be skeptical about the approach that Nabokov is taking to his main character.
Yeah. Well, and then so when you were getting into this book, and we were talking before we started about, there's so much that's really interesting in the structure, and some of that I personally feel protective of, because I really enjoyed, protective of not saying too much about, but also sort of fun to talk about. But there's something really lovely in the way you reveal layers of who the narrator is. And so I guess just how did that evolve for you in the writing of the book?
I suppose that at the very beginning, I should say there is a relationship between the main character and my real father, but that relationship attenuated over the course of the writing. So that, interestingly, at the very beginning, when so much of it was, so much of the things that I was writing was really like just working out grief, really. It was being a writer, grieving. And what does a writer do when grieving but write? And so I was writing my way out of a sense of loss, and also in the direction of something different for me. I wanted to put aside, well, I suppose interestingly, I put aside everything that I eventually returned to actually write the book, but I put it aside during this period of time in order to simply, I suppose, just sort of resuscitate my dad, like see him there in scenes that I might recognize. And there was a decided lack of subtext to that. because it was all just sort of like the presentation of the real or the actual. And oftentimes it was about his ailing or even his dying. And these scenes would just sort of sit there. You know, they didn't have that something that makes a writer go, well, now you're cooking, right? Now you're writing fiction. And for a long time, I was really trying to scrutinize the possibilities that we have as writers simply to allow reality to inform a scene or a chapter or an entire novel. Like what does it take? It should be sufficient, right? The stuff that happens out here should simply be sufficient to live right on the page and for everybody to go, oh yes, I recognize that, or oh, that moves me, or that's humorous, or whatever the case may be. But very often during those early years, I found it this kind of, you know, flatlining. So I had to fold in these subtexts, and I had to fold in these reveals and reversals and a sense of real moment. And what was so funny about that, or I suppose ironic, and you will know this well, is the realization that those kind of fictional techniques actually started to get closer to the truth.
Right. Interesting.
I have no idea why or how that happened. I have no clue. It's a real mystery, but indeed it is a fact that when writing fiction, to make things up resounds with more reality to, at least to the writer, you know, than just letting things from reality present themselves as if, or without adornment.
So it was when the fictionalizing came in is when you felt the flat line turn, you know, resuscitate essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you said you put certain things aside that you'd leaned on in the past, what are those things?
Humor.
Okay.
Humor.
Okay.
Really, because it was serious business. Somebody had died, you know. It was a father. It was a son's love for a father. It was a man's life. His, you know, certain things that obviously now I'm talking very differently because the guy that became Charlie Barnes is imagined, and the guy that was my father was just, he was more in, I think, in tune probably with reality. He was a little bit more, you know, I start the book off at a chapter called Farce.
Mm-hmm.
And the only person that really thought my father was a farce was my mother. And even then, eventually, by the time that he reached, you know, the moment when he died, she was fully convinced of his, you know, full reality. But there was it was a defining moment when she thought of him as a kind of a farcical character or a joke when I was young, and I could see that in him. But, you know, early on, I just wanted to get away from that kind of presentation and present him as full. And so humor just sort of has to go away. And I also just thought that the nature of the beast, the fact that I was writing about loss, just required a greater leash or something. I don't know. I mean, inevitably, you know, you find yourself in writing something over a long period of time. You can't escape yourself. And so it was really when I folded that back in that suddenly the subtexts and a lot of the other, just the voice came to me, and I could play again, and it felt like I wasn't grieving, I was playing. And that was important as well. But I didn't want to do that at first. I just, I don't know. I bored myself.
Or there's like a tribute quality, you know, to the fictionalized character, and then clearly to the part of him that's real. But it's funny because it's all ends up, there's humor in all of it at this point, right? So it's like it all, even in the loss and even in the concern, I think it's just because the sentences have such snap, like there's no way that they just operate in a certain way that allows for humor even in the really sad moments. But I think, I mean, it also makes me want to ask you, there's something, it felt like wonderfully, one of the characters is very emphatic in a way that I consistently found moving about how much he loves Charlie Barnes, and like that love is sort of this guiding force. It's utterly believable, and it's also complicated by all the members of the family, as is, you know, true in the epigraph, which we talked about a little bit, which is just like the best epigraph. Takes a little moment. But I guess Yeah, I'm just curious in terms of that, like, did that feel like sort of a new thing to be playing with, which was just to have sort of this very open-hearted character who's insisting almost again and again in various moments of dialogue, right, to just declare his love for his father, and how I don't know, I felt like they ended up being really crucial moments in the book, as quiet as they sometimes were. So I'm just curious what you would say about that.
Well, it's interesting that you come right. I mean, you're really picking up actually on the progress of the book, because what was so fascinating to me is that my unadulterated love for my father did not come off when I was writing this book as me. So for a while, right, I thought, well, I guess, even though I sort of always saw it as a critique of sorts of a kind of autofiction that takes the name of the author and inserts it and then makes the reader puzzle out whether or not any of this actually happened. For a long time, I did in fact call this character that was him, me, because as I say, it started off in a different mode. When it was clearly, you know, something that was entirely fictionalized, and there were these reversals and revelations that can't come from a straight up account of my life, I gave myself the liberty to be undefended.
Right. He's undefended.
Totally undefended. And
Really nice.
And weirdly, like, you buy it, whereas you didn't. I never bought it coming from me.
So interesting.
What is that about?
Yeah. Well, it's just a little defended, you know, like it was there, but it's just got this little defense, whereas it feels like it's, I mean, and the fact, yeah, this is where I just don't want to get into spoilers, but there's just stuff about the character that allow space maybe for him to occupy that defenseless emotional place. Yeah.
I mean, maybe coming from me, I felt, if I'm going to confess love, it has to be done in a sophisticated manner. You have to go around the subject or something, you know. I couldn't really figure out what it was that was preventing me from having me, you know, say it and stick. But it always, maybe it just seemed a little more tortured than what this guy has, which is like, I just love the dude.
Yeah, right. It's really pure. And he's also really unafraid to announce it, to like express it. But I think that's the fiction writers, and that's the beauty of fiction. David Shields, who I really love as a writer, but he often would talk about why nonfiction was more appealing to him, and I would just listen and think about, you know, I think that fictional act of imagination is the thing, of course, I believe too, can get us closer to the bone of something. And who knows why, as you say. It's the great mystery.
Yeah, it is a mystery.
Of the imagination.
It's a mystery. I mean, even when I was writing nonfiction, I was essentially writing nonfiction at a certain point in time.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do it then either. It seemed less like genre or type of writing that you're doing, and more like this total disconnect, which brought it a real sorrow to me at a certain point between life and representation. Like, there's just, for me as the writer, there's simply always going to be a buffer or an opaque thing that I'm never going to be able to lift life to the fullest and put it on the page in the way that totally satisfies. And yeah, there was just like that was like the real discovery that I had over these 5 years, is that there were simply things that I wasn't going to be able to do that really did exist. And
I mean, and it makes me think too, like, even, I'm sure there probably was subtext creeping in that, because as soon as you render something into language, it starts to change, and there's it is different than life already. But I think maybe what fiction does is it sort of honestly acknowledges that we can't capture it in language, so it's already something different. Now, and did you read Trust Exercise, by the way? Because that came to my Susan Choi's book.
I haven't read it.
It's wonderful, but it also kind of plays with narrative surprises totally recommend it. But it very different, but also in that way that you start to rearrange your sense of who's telling and what's being told, and
Yeah, I've heard this very thing, and I'm eager to read it. People have pressed it on me because they've loved it and seen some parallels.
Yeah, I think there are some. So, I mean, let's just take them before, because we have a little time. I'd love to talk a little bit about Irvine, because I also did think of Jeffrey Wolf with this book, because he wrote Duke of Deception, and you studied with Jeffrey, right? I mean, he was there. Yeah. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of your formation as a writer, since that's something like just that brings you to this point here of a book that allowed you the space to kind of explore this nonfiction piece and let it transform into fiction, but how, I don't know, just Jeffrey came to my mind, and I felt like it'd be nice to spend a little time talking about him.
Well, I have to say that, reading The Duke of Deception when I had actually a long section of this book early on, with my dad and I talking about The Duke of Deception, where
Really,
we had this real conversation where I think I brought Duke of Deception over to the table at a Borders bookstore when Borders was still around. And I said, this is the guy I'm going to go to study with at Irvine. And he looked at it, he goes, but this is nonfiction. And I said, well, yeah, it's a memoir. He goes, why are you going to go study fiction with a memoir? And it was a fairly practical question, but I said, well, I mean, all of it is kind of the same. And he goes, that really took great umbrage at that. What do you mean? This fiction is fiction, and nonfiction is nonfiction is true. And there was an ethical distinction too, to some extent. Like,
interesting.
You can't be honest in fiction. You have to turn to nonfiction to be honest. Fiction is something you guys go and make up in your brains or whatever. Well, that's an aside. I think The Duke of Deception was
so related to everything you were just saying, though. Like, it's so connected. Like, the conversation, it's so connected to what you were saying about the process of writing the book and like the nonfiction. It's just interesting,
Very much. I mean, it was even on my mind back then. And also his reaction to those things were on my mind. My father's reaction as a kind of fixed point, as a fixed place, either as a man or as a representative of the culture or society or something. Like, what was fiction to this everyman? What was nonfiction to this everyman? And the remarkable thing that happens in The Duke of Deception, to my mind, is when he goes to his mother and he says, tell me about me. I want to know your perceptions of me. And she hesitates, and he says, I want you to be honest. Please be honest. And she does it. And it's this incredibly unvarnished account of her struggle with him, her struggle in general. And it's just so pitilessly honest that it's becomes so moving. And that's that book for me, and that is something that I think I just strive for constantly, that kind of moment where you pierce through something and become so honest with the thing that you're doing that you just feel it all the time. And I can't read that book without weeping. I love that book.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. Yeah. It makes me actually think something about the piercing view of the mom, and that makes me think a little of the Barbara character in Charlie Barnes, and how much I loved her as a character, and also how, as a reader, I don't really know what she's like in a way that I really like. She is so formed by people's perceptions of her, and I just find that really interesting, that how unknowable she is to me as a reader in a way that feels true, because no one quite gets her, but they get a little closer to her. And would you talk about her a little bit? I feel like she ends up being quite important.
She really is. I mean, I have to say that in that instance, the predication on a real life person is impossible to avoid.
Right.
It's so complicating for me because I never knew this person. I spent half my life with her. And I don't know her any better today than I did back then. And that confoundedness is weirdly characteristic. It is deeply within someone to be that unknowable, to make themselves that unknowable.
Right.
And I struggled with trying to depict this because it also seemed like a terrible failing on the novelist's part.
No, I mean, I don't think so, but go ahead.
I mean, the inner life is sort of thought of as being what the novelist does well. And I had no access. So it could easily be confused for me not doing my job, or me failing to understand, or me failing to capture. But I had no choice because I never captured her in life.
No, I mean, I think the reason I found her so compelling is it felt like the frame that was knowable was so fully and clearly described, but she was very, very private in some way that was not going to be shown to the reader or any of the other characters. But I didn't doubt that there was a lot in there, actually. I felt that there was, I was just talking about the book Disgrace with a friend, and there's character Lucy in Disgrace, the daughter, and she says something like, "You can't tell my story. This is my story." And the book very clearly does not, but only shows her. And I feel like there's something similar in that Barbara's experience is hers, and yet she's very clear to me, and I kind of like her. Like I found myself interested, but I think it's that there's something very honest about her as a figure on the page.
Well, that's thrilling to hear. I'm very pleased by that, because I think, I had to reorient my own affection in the direction of this character who, could have gone either way for me because of the person that she represented. Remained such a cipher for me that I could have done sort of anything with that person, make her lovable, make her hateable, whatever. But I really did, really make a lot of effort to make this inscrutability
right
vibrant.
Yeah, I thought it was. I think it's the difference between feeling like the character doesn't have an internal life on the page because we're not seeing it, versus feeling like there isn't I don't even know if I set this up right, but just, there's an internal life. It's just belongs to her,
It's inaccessible to you.
Yeah, and that's life. I mean, that feels true. It's just that it didn't feel that she felt two-dimensional. I felt that there was a lot going on. Yeah, and just before we turn to questions from the audience, I'm wondering too, just about if you could talk a little bit about point of view, because I feel like the novel's also really existing. I mean, that there's sort of this buried first person for a long time, and then the presence, the kind of arrival, that part I will clearly just revealed. But how that on a craft level sort of worked for you, that there really is sort of a sense of a third person narrator for a long time before you realize who's telling the story.
I think there was a lot of struggle for me to actually say, oh, I'm writing a book about a character like my dad, with my dad's concerns for a long time. It was more like, hey, I don't know what the case may have been, but I got a point of view here, whatever. I want to talk about me for a moment. And that would preoccupy my day and the next day and the following day. And it just never went anywhere. I just didn't like it. I don't know. I mean, I would have loved to be able to, write about my grief or my whatever, it just didn't work. And so it was a moment of giving myself entirely over to my father's concerns, and then adapting them for the book and for my own imaginative purposes, that this book took off. And it was really that leap. And I recognized, I suppose, pretty belatedly for a fiction writer, how hard that leap is. Like, that leap is so impossible to make. And we struggle to do it out in the world with real people every day, to just even set aside your social anxiety for a moment and wonder what the thinking is coming at you, what the observation is coming at you. And to not only like think of it as an academic matter, but to try to get inside it and imagine it in real time and have sympathy with it, even if the affect or the speech or whatever the case may be is off-putting or even hateful. It's enormously difficult. And I could only kind of barely do it with a guy that looked a hell of a lot like my dad. So I thought, I'm enormously deficient here, but nevertheless, finally I'm writing fiction. And so it was only at that moment in time but I also knew that the story required not just his point of view, that this storytelling son who is determining things is doing so with a very specific purpose that is revealed as the story goes on. And that was always the goal. Like the goal was to get to a moment in the book where I could play around with the stories being presented and have a lot of fun. That was always the goal, even from the very, very beginning. And it was only upon getting there that I realized that I was finally writing the book that I wanted to write, that I had always intended to write. And that really did require that kind of blended perspective. But I would add that this had an ethical dimension, these blended perspectives, because it seemed to me that to meet someone halfway, as the phrase goes, is to express a certain amount of love and respect for that person. I mean, this is what happens in a marriage. It's what happens between parents and children. It's what happens between neighbors and friends. And it's whenever anything good happens, it's because there's some kind of meeting of two minds that blends perspectives and understands the other person and respects them and all the rest. And that was really where I suddenly recognized that even though I had left my father behind, and it was no longer just an act of memorialization, that I was doing the most important thing, which is loving him by giving him at least some account.
Oh, I mean, there's so much love in the book. Like Spencer described your writing as tender, and I think that's such a great word, because in the humor and in the wit, like it just feels like that, might not be acknowledged as much as it should. And here it feels like it's really front and center, like it just, and it quite beautifully.
Thank you.
Well, hey, I'm back. I just wanted to, first of all, thank the two of you. This has been a really wonderful conversation to listen in on. I hope if you can hear the sound of my voice right now, if you have questions, we're about to turn over or transition to the audience Q&A portion of our event. Go ahead, submit those questions to the Q&A box. I'll be reading them out loud and kind of appearing and disappearing from the screen. So our first question comes from Sarah Czar, who asks, and this is a great question. I can't wait to hear the answer. I know that Josh is the opposite of very online, and I feel like this is a rare and hard move for writers these days and a real intentional choice. On the business side, I wonder if he, and also Aimee too, have had pushback from publishers about not maintaining a platform between books. And on the creative side, I would love to hear a little bit or hear a little inspiration from either of you about how great and probably important it is to be at this kind of remove for your work. Is that last part? Sorry, I switched things around a little bit, but essentially I think she's asking like, how is it important to, or why is it important to be at a remove for the sake of your work?
Are you online, Aimee? Are you on social media and all that?
I'm just on Twitter, but I'm not a big poster. I just, find it helpful with the news.
Yeah.
It's like a little community complaining. It's helpful. So you are not at all. Yeah. I'm not
at all. Yeah.
Smart.
I don't know. I mean, it's a vexed choice. It's not an easy one. And it's not like I'm avoiding it. I'm there every day. I mean, if I'm going to get an update from my kids' teacher, or if I'm going to, do this or whatever, you have to engage electronically. So I'm not avoiding it deliberately. I think by this point, it's kind of a habit more than anything. At first, I suppose there were more principled positions about the devaluation of speech, the easiness of hurtful criticism, the consumption of time, the simple practical matter of that, and the diversion, the distraction, all the rest. But I don't know that, especially during the pandemic when everything went electronic, there's no way of avoiding it. So I think now it is basically probably at the end of the day, as Sarah seems to be suggesting, self-preservation. And it's vital for there to be big swaths of time uninterrupted by the internet and all of its demands. And so I think simply now not doing some of the things that my friends do, and I'm just trying to preserve the focus that is very, very difficult to sustain on the best of days, but that is totally crucial to writing a book.
Yeah, I agree.
Our next question comes from Stacy Flood, who I am pretty sure is Stacy Flood, author of The Salt Fields. I'm assuming Stacy, this is Stacy the writer Stacy, because the question involves something or about Saul Bellows Seize the Day. Anyways, the question is, first of all, such a great discussion. Thank you both. Josh, you write so wonderfully about the business world. Was Saul Bellows Seize the Day an influence? Thinking of that first line, when it came to concealing his troubles, Tommy Wilhelm was not less capable than the next fellow. And would you say that the main themes of literature relating to the business world lean more towards connection or towards loneliness?
Wow, what a good question.
And Stacy also gives a plug for The Butterfly Lampshade, which I have here. It is an excellent book, highly recommended.
I'm going to do something. It's this. I walked into a used bookstore in Brooklyn. This was probably like 10 years ago. And when I opened the door, this huge plume of marijuana smoke just bowled me over. So I walk in and the guy's just behind the counter and he's like fried. And I start to parade around and I find this copy of Seize the Day. And I open it up and it's really super old and cute, right? And I open it up and it's $3. Can you see that? You can see that. And I open it up a little bit farther and it's signed by Bello.
What?
It says, "For Lionel, affectionately Saul." I have to think that, I've never had it. Of course you can't see it because it's reversed, but.
Exactly what? And also how did Stacy intuit this
I don't know.
you just lifted it off your book.
I know, it's right up there, the special, see the special books? Those
Yeah.
are the special books.
Wow.
So Stacy was really onto something. Yeah, it was an enormously important book to me, as was The Adventures of Augie March, because of that, it grabs you and takes you. I think what Seize the Day does that Augie March does not do is remember it's a book. It has an ending that's incredibly satisfying and totally soul destroying. Whereas the Augie March just sort of meanders away and eventually exhausts me. And this perfect book, Seize the Day, is just so perfect because it culminates in something and there's such heart and such loss, and it's just a wonderful book. But I would have to answer the second part of the question by saying loneliness. I when I think of the books that we've discussed already, I think of Panine, I think of Something Happened by Joseph Heller, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, and many iterations too, like Dreiser did it, and Silas Marie and a guy did it, and I forget his name, and every iteration, unless it's Horatio Alger, chasing the American dream in literature ends in destruction and loneliness, and in some kind of even the loss of one's soul. So, I think to some extent it is the nature of the beast that it's very hard to retain your ethics or your emotional life if you're trying to make a killing all the time. And I think very often in these books in which men are trying to make a killing, they inevitably end up killing themselves and losing their souls. I also find it incredibly interesting, this very conservative streak in American literature in particular, in which greater enlightenment is always disillusionment that usually leads to some kind of loss of social standing or death. And there doesn't seem to be, to me, to be a lot of counterexamples to that very dire opinion that change is impossible unless it's in the direction of greater disillusionment, which leads usually the hero or the heroine to, some terrible dispatch. But certainly business and the dire economic situation that everybody's always facing has something to do with that.
Right. We have, I think, one last question here from Jean Barry, who asks, many writers of fiction use outlines and have a sense of where the plot is going. I'm not sure if you outline or if you write as the story reveals itself with no idea of where it will end up. But since this book began as nonfiction before shifting into fiction, how did this affect your writing process overall? And did the plot develop first as it went? And how closely did the fiction version align with your nonfiction theme?
In the end, it had to be very, very outlined. It had to be very point by point by point by point, because it was, after this other writing got done, it was very specific. I had a very clear idea, as I mentioned before. Once I get to that moment, I knew I'd written the book that I had always meant to write and wanted to write. So it had to be much more outlined than any book that I'd ever read or written before, because it just had to hit these moments. And it was weirdly getting all of this stuff into the outline that caused my greatest grief, because it had to be there. It had to go through these movements and these very specific shifts, these tonal shifts and these perspective shifts and these just changes in the approach to the fiction. And that was all very specifically outlined, very meticulously outlined. So eventually I got rid of all this freestyle writing, this grief writing, this automatic writing, this crap, and could just direct myself toward the very, specific requirements of the book that I had in mind.
What did that, like when you say meticulously outlined, like what does that look like? Because in some ways it surprises me because of the way the prose flows and has a sort of spontaneity. So what does that look like?
It had sections that were better than others, basically, for a long time. So that I would spend all my time on making sure that this, say the fourth of 5 sections, or how many ever there are, was perfect. But the third had proportional problems and like plot issues. And I would be like, I would give it to a reader, like my wife or my agent, and I would say, but the 4th section's really good, right? Meanwhile, the book is collapsing under the weight of its own pretensions and misguided concerns. But the 4th section was really good. So that's sort of how it was, right? Like I had the outline and I made sure certain crucial parts of that outline worked before I would go back and say, okay, well, I can do 4, and that was the great challenge, but now I got to make sure that 3 is up to snuff. And I remember a good friend saying to me, boy, the book really falls off around page 152, when it was very, until that moment in time, he really nailed it. And so then I was really, I realized that but I couldn't do it all at once. So I had just sort of had to get the big thing down and then go back and work on various sections.
Yeah, good to hear.
And before we wrap up, I hope you don't mind. I wanted to actually ask a question as well, throw something in from the audience, quote unquote. I really loved what you were, when you were talking about Nabokov's Panine, and you were comparing Charlie Barnes to Panine, and you said something about there being a sense of failure throughout that novel and throughout that character's way of talking about, the cultural history of Russia. I was wondering, in what sense do you think that failure is important in fiction, particularly fiction that's largely based off your own life? And Aimee, I'd love to, if you have an answer to this as well, I'd love to hear it.
This particular book was probably, a lot of it was predicated upon family failure, like the failure of marriages to work out. And I would have to say that that more than anything, any other single thing in my life was defining of who I am and how I think and, my development, all the rest of it. And I don't know, I suppose to some extent, I'm just drawn to failures. I did a lot of failure in this book. I wrote a ton that was bad, in part because, as I have said many times tonight, it was grief writing. It wasn't good. But that stuff weirdly made me understand so much better the people I was writing about. Like, it was weird. I had to experience it myself in these undiluted months in order to really get a sense of the kind of failure that I was trying to talk about. So I'm no stranger to it. And I'm just probably drawn to it because they seem to be, necessary and to discuss, necessary to bring to life.
Yeah, anything you wanted to add, Aimee, before we close out for the night?
I mean, the main thing it makes me think of, because it seems like on some level we could find failure present in all our favorite characters to some degree, right? Because it's like the happy family, the successful person has to be some crack. But there's a great Kay Ryan poem that called Failure Too. And it's like there could be nutrients in failure, deep amendments to the shallow soil of wishes. Think of the dark and bitter flavors of black ales and peasant loaves. Think of licorices. So I just love that. And it goes on a little bit more. But
wow,
it's one of the
that's incredible.
It's incredible.
Nice recall.
Yeah, no kidding.
Nice recall.
Fair. I have a few up here. It's one of them. So it's because I think of moments of failure that I've experienced. It's been very soothing.
Yeah.
Black ales and peasant loaves, right?
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, Aimee, thank you so much for doing this tonight. This has been really wonderful. This has been just fantastic. I'm so excited to have witnessed this conversation. Third Place Books has, a bunch of copies of A Calling for Charlie Barnes ready for you all to pick up. Again, we have these
Third Place Books. We love Third Place Books.
We have these beautiful signed book plates. Really, this is an instant favorite book of mine. It's as humbling and sharp as it is entertaining, like so many of Josh's books. I will also, put in one last plug for Aimee's newest novel, Butterfly Lampshade, out in paperback now. Other than that, on behalf of the bookstore, please be well, everyone, and have a wonderful week.
Thank you both.
Thank you both.
Bye.